Join us on Patreon and become part of our journey to uncover history's untold stories. Your support helps us create in-depth content, bring hidden narratives to life, and keep history alive for everyone.
History is often remembered through the eyes of those who held the power to write it down. And yet, hidden within the dust of ancient scrolls, etched onto stone walls, and whispered through generations of oral tradition, lies another version of the past, a version deliberately obscured, dismissed, or erased. It is the story of the Hebrew presence in ancient Egypt, not as faceless slaves alone, but as a people intertwined with dynasties, bloodlines, and the throne of the pharaohs themselves. For centuries, scholars have debated the extent of Israel's connection to Egypt, but when one looks carefully at the fragments of archaeology, linguistic ties, and ancient records, the startling truth begins to emerge. The Hebrews were not merely a foreign people within Egypt. They carried bloodlines that merged with the very rulers of the Nile. And when this history threatened to shift the accepted narratives of power, it was hidden, silenced, and forgotten. From the beginning, Egypt was the cradle of African civilization, deeply rooted in the Nubian and Kushite world. Its kings and queens bore features that aligned with their Black African heritage, a fact confirmed by countless depictions and skeletal remains. Yet, within these dynasties, there were sudden shifts, names, religious reforms, and even changes in burial customs that bore striking resemblance to Hebrew traditions. The period of the Hyksos, for example, saw Semitic-speaking rulers seize power in northern Egypt. Later records would brand them foreign oppressors, but archaeological findings suggest something more complicated. Their gods, their practices, and their names overlapped with those known among early Israelites. Rather than being simple invaders, these people may have represented Hebrew tribes who merged with Egyptian nobility, embedding themselves into the very heart of pharaonic power. When examining figures such as Joseph, the Hebrew patriarch who rose to the position of vizier, one finds a story that could not have been fabricated without some basis in memory. Egyptian inscriptions reveal officials of Asiatic origin who held high office, wore collars of authority, and bore shaved heads in pharaonic fashion. The tomb of a Semitic vizier found in Avaris bears artistic details remarkably similar to the biblical Joseph's account. If Joseph's rise was more than myth, then his marriage to Asenath, daughter of an Egyptian priest, suggests that Hebrew bloodlines entered the priestly and royal houses of Egypt. Their children, Ephraim and Manasseh, would not only belong to Israel, but would also inherit a direct Egyptian lineage, connecting the tribes of Israel to pharaonic power. Centuries later, one encounters Moses, raised in Pharaoh's house, trained in royal custom, and by all accounts considered a prince of Egypt. The adoption of a Hebrew child into the royal household is not merely an act of compassion. It was a recognition of shared ancestry and kinship. Some traditions claim that Moses himself was in line for the throne before his destiny called him elsewhere. Even in his name, Moshe, meaning drawn out, echoes the suffix Mos found in pharaonic names such as Thutmose and Amos, suggesting the blurring of Hebrew and Egyptian identity within the bloodlines of royalty. Egyptian art and text also reflect this merging. Certain dynasties of the New Kingdom, particularly during the reign of Akhenaten, bear striking parallels to Hebrew theology. Akhenaten's radical devotion to one god, Aten, has long puzzled historians. Why would a pharaoh suddenly abandon the rich polytheism of Egypt for a singular, invisible deity? The answer may lie in contact with Hebrews, who carried their monotheistic tradition from Abraham. If Akhenaten's reforms were influenced by Hebrew kinship, then the suppression of his memory by later dynasties reveals why this history was buried. His bloodline was tarnished by association with Hebrews, whose growing identity as a distinct people would eventually threaten Egypt's dominance. Archaeology further supports this hidden history. Excavations in Avaris, the capital of the Hyksos and later a Hebrew settlement, reveal homes with distinct Levantine styles, Asiatic burials, and artifacts inscribed with names recognizable from the Israelite tradition. Yet these settlements were not mere ghettos of slaves. They held wealth, cattle, and even ceremonial items, suggesting a people who rose high in society before their eventual decline. Ancient Egyptian records, such as the Apur Papyrus, describe chaos, plagues, and slaves who took gold upon their departure, details mirroring the biblical Exodus. But to admit the Hebrews were kin, perhaps even of Pharaonic descent, was unacceptable for dynasties who sought to project pure divine rulership. Thus, their connection was erased. The erasure continued into later centuries. As Greek and Roman historians began to dominate the retelling of Egypt's past, the African roots of pharaohs were diminished, and the Hebrew presence was reduced to a narrative of enslavement and escape. The possibility of Hebrew kingship within Egypt was silenced because it disrupted both Jewish and Egyptian nationalist narratives, and later Christian theology as well. If Hebrews and pharaohs shared bloodlines, then the story of divine separation collapses. The Hebrews would no longer be a distant, oppressed people. They would be heirs of Egypt itself. The cover-up became most effective during colonial times, when European scholars reinterpreted both Egyptian and Hebrew history to fit racial ideologies. Black African pharaohs were dismissed or whitened in art, while Hebrews were cast as an entirely separate Semitic group. In doing so, the shared bloodlines were obscured, and the evidence of Hebrew pharaonic kinship faded into the background. Yet modern genetic studies and continued archaeological work are beginning to reawaken this truth. Nubian, Egyptian, and Levantine DNA intermingled for centuries, and the Israelites, far from being outsiders, were part of this great web of African civilization. The story of the hidden Black Hebrew bloodline of the pharaohs is not one of myth, but of deliberate erasure. It speaks to a time when dynasties feared the truth of their own ancestry, when priests destroyed records, and when historians rewrote the past. But fragments remain, scattered across papyri, tombs, and oral memory, waiting to be pieced together. The question is not whether the Hebrews and pharaohs were linked, but why their connection was silenced. Perhaps it was because the truth, that divine kingship and chosen lineage were one and the same, was too dangerous for empire, religion, and race to accept. What remains is a challenge to modern readers, to look beyond the polished histories of empire and return to the buried truths of our ancestors. For within those hidden connections lies the real story of human civilization, one where power, blood, and faith were shared across boundaries, and where the pharaohs of Egypt may have carried in their veins the legacy of the Hebrews themselves.